Chapter 24. What Shines with the Dawn. As they traveled further down the spiraling stairs, Daniel would light other torches mounted along the wall with his torch, creating a series of flames that glowed in the dark, making the staircase seem not so dreadful as before. Soon there was no longer a wall to their left where Daniel had been lighting torches. The stairs continued to spiral down a large, massive pillar, but the only thing to their left was a 3-foot-tall wall that continued down the rest of the stairs. Beyond that was a pitch-black room. Daniel stopped and turned around where the wall merged from its full scale down to its smaller 3-foot form. "Soaring Eagle," he said. "Did you close the door behind you?" "Yes," said Charles. "Good." Virginia looked past Daniel into the distant darkness of the room. "Is this a cave?" Daniel smiled and laid his torch on the top of the little wall. As if it had struck gasoline, the top of the wall caught on fire and its flame raced down the spiraling wall like a river on fire. Virginia jumped back. She could hear the fire continuing to rush down the rest of the wall, of the stairs. The more it did, the more the room began to glow softly. She looked down over the flaming wall. The darkness that was once there began to fade away as a large, massive, dome-like room began to glow with light. She watched as the flame parted and branched off into 7 streams along carved channels, hewed into the sides of the dome room, one at waist level at the ground below, and the others in 6 different channels evenly spaced out, creating rings of fire encompassing the room that stretched to the ceiling. On the floor were 3 other waist-high walls, evenly dividing the room, each with a span of fire dancing across their tops. What was once a dark room now glowed by firelight with an ancient touch. "This room was set apart from all other rooms in this whole city," said Daniel. "It holds the lost, forgotten treasures of Alaythia and the City of the Lion." Virginia walked closer to the wall, yet stood slightly back to avoid getting burned. Standing up on her toes, she looked down at the room. The floors were covered with gold and silver coins, rubies, gems, and diamonds. In different parts of the room were groups of different swords, shields, armor, and other weaponry, anything from battle axes to tomahawks, daggers to bows and arrows, chainmail for humans, and armor for horses. Painted along the walls above each fire channel were different murals of stories that ran around the room from top to bottom. "Come," said Daniel. His voice echoed in the stone room. "There is something down here for you." He turned and continued walking down the spiraling stone staircase, with Andrew following close behind. Virginia and Charles followed them. "Where did all of these things come from again?" asked Virginia. "Some of them came from different nations and kingdoms of another time," said Daniel. "Times were turning into a new era, and they felt it important that the next generations know their history, so they stored some of their most precious articles here so that the people would never forget the days of old. The rest of the artifacts were recovered from the City of the Lion during the Great Division. This room holds many of the lost sacred relics, artifacts, weaponry, historical documents, and memories of the waters of Alaythia, my people." Virginia stopped walking. "Your people?" "Yes," answered Daniel. "And mine, as well," said Andrew. Virginia trotted down the stairs to catch back up to them. Wait, you're both from the waters of Alaythia? Uncle Andrew?" Daniel and Andrew reached the bottom of the stairs, stepped off onto the stone floor, and turned around to look at Virginia and Charles. "Yes, we are," said Andrew. "As are you, honey." Virginia was about to take the last step off the stairs and onto the stone floor when she froze in her tracks. "I'm sorry, what?" Andrew looked at Charles. "You haven't told her yet?" Charles shook his head. "My, Prince of Leaping Bird, you can keep a secret." Virginia looked over her shoulder at Charles. "Yeah, he's quite a book of mystery, aren't you, my prince?" Charles gave a faint smirk and motioned with his hand for Virginia to take the last step. She stepped onto the stone floor, never taking her curious eyes off him. "Will I find out eventually about you?" Charles's smirk grew a little. "Maybe. For now, let's focus on you." "Come," said Daniel. "This way." He turned around and continued to walk straight ahead. To the left of them was one of the 3-foot walls of flames dancing upon its top. Beyond that, about 30 feet to the left, was another wall with the same flames dancing on top of it, and 30 feet beyond that wall was the 3rd short wall, with its fire burning on top. To the far back, near the stairs, she could see where all 3 of these walls joined together and branched off. She looked to her right at the expansive wall beside her, with its many paintings and rings of fire wrapping around the chamber. Virginia gazed at the paintings on the walls as she followed the elders. Upon the different levels of the fire channels, some murals told stories of people dancing, drinking from big goblets, playing musical instruments, laughing, rejoicing. Other levels displayed a picture of a volcano and a talon of dark fire stretching out of it. Another one in particular, which bled from the one where the people were dancing and rejoicing, caught her eye. It was of a city under attack by men and creatures that were too frightening for her to look at, yet too intriguing to avert her eyes. She already recognized some of them. Wolf-like beings surrounded by a dark mist with people inside their massive jaws and hooked in their claw-like paws. Flying in the air over the city were winged creatures with talons for feet. They seemed to be half on fire with red sulfur billowing out of their nostrils and possessed long snake fangs in the upper set of their teeth. Their pictures showed them biting men and women with their fangs. The skin of the victims ensnared in the monster's bites hung like loose bags on their skeletons, as if the blood had been drained from their bodies. There were other paintings across the wall, each displaying graphic illustrations of horrific ancient battles waged against different kinds of demonic creatures. However, there was one mural in particular that Virginia could not seem to shake. Groups of men, women, and even children blazed on fire with a dark flame similar to the fire from the volcano painting. They did not appear to be victims of the attack, for they ran at the citizens of a city with curved swords, tomahawks, axes, chains, nets, and whips. Their eyes were no longer visible. Only blackness remained where their eyes sat. Upon a closer glance, she noticed they all had one thing in common. Their right ears, right thumbs, and right big toes were missing. The whole city was set on fire. The city's walls lay in ruins. Homes and buildings were destroyed. People were either seen dead on the ground, fleeing for their lives, or being led away as captives and slaves. "This way," said Daniel, turning left. As if snapping out of a dream, Virginia looked and saw Daniel turning left and walking alongside the back of the room. The 3 divisions that branched along the ground stopped about 10 feet before touching the back wall, creating a path for the company to walk. They reached the far corner and turned left. In the center of the wall was a small opening hewed out of the rock. On either side of the entrance were mounted 2 unlit torches. The space was so dark that she could not tell if it led into a tunnel or a room, but she would have to duck her head to enter. "What is this spot?" she asked. "This isn't some dark, scary tunnel that I have to walk down alone, is it? Not like the 'this is your tunnel of destiny that you must walk down alone for your final test' kind of thing, right?" Daniel smiled and shook his head. "No, it's not a tunnel, but it is for you." He lit both torches on either side of its entrance, casting a soft glow upon the darkness inside, exposing a small opening chiseled into the wall with a stone slab in its center. Resting on the slab was a single sword with a blade of about 2.5 feet. Its handle was crafted of tanned leather, its handguard of white gold, and a small crystal orb rested at the end of its hilt. Daniel reached in, grabbed the sword by its sheath, and brought it out. "There was once a powerful warrior, Virginia," said Daniel. "A strong warrior. She brought hope and help to the men of battle, protected the innocent when evil came in the night, and with honor, united the people and tribes of Oralmuti, preparing them for any kind of assault of the forces of darkness. The fire of Oralmuti was what she fought with in battle." He held out the sword, and with this. Virginia looked with wondrous eyes at the sword. The sheath was wrapped in the same tan leather as the sword's handle grip. At the top of the sheath was a blossoming rosebud, decorated in white gold. A long, thorny stem trailed from the end of the rosebud and wrapped around the sheath in a spiral formation until it reached the very end. "That warrior was the legendary Rose Cohen," said Daniel. He spun the sword around, pointing its handle at Virginia for her to take, and this was her sword. She reached out her fingertips to touch the crystal orb at the end of its handle. This was her sword? "It's yours now," said Andrew gladly. Virginia's eyes widened. "Mine?" "Yes," affirmed Daniel. "As you have seen from upstairs, the men have been very anxious to find out if you are truly Cohen, who has returned to us. There is one way that we can be certain." Virginia was almost too scared to ask. "And what's that?" Daniel held out the sword handle closer to her. "Draw Aurora from her sheath, and she will tell us if you are who we think you are." "Aurora?" asked Virginia. "That's the name of the sword of Rose Cohen," said Andrew. "Aurora, the light of Oralmuti." Virginia stood holding out her hand towards Aurora's handle. Her old curiosity was beginning to guide her choices. Seeing that all eyes were waiting for her to make a move, she gave in to curiosity. She reached out the rest of the way and wrapped her fingers elegantly around the handle of the sword, and with a smooth, guided stroke, she softly pulled it out of the sheath. The blade was of the same crystal matter as Charles's sword. She looked around at Daniel, Andrew, and Charles, all of them focused on the sword as if expecting and waiting for it to speak words to them. However, a good minute passed by, and Aurora held her tongue. "It's a beautiful sword," said Virginia. "Thank you for it." She noticed that a downcast expression fell upon all their faces. Daniel dropped his arm by his side, holding the sheath loosely in his grip. Andrew's shoulders dropped, but he still tried to keep a cheerful smile on his face. She could not see Charles's face, but could feel the air of disappointment floating around him. "Is everything okay?" asked Virginia. Daniel looked at Andrew. "We were wrong, weren't we?" Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but could not find any words to say. Virginia felt Charles's hand upon her shoulder. She looked back and saw that he was not disappointed at all, but instead held that same old familiar smile of his that she had seen when she first met him in the hallway of Mason High. "What's the matter?" she asked, looking back and forth at all three of them. "Was something supposed to happen? Did I do something wrong?" "Virginia," said Charles, "from the stories written down in history, whenever Rose Cohen would hold Aurora in her hands, something would happen." "What would happen?" she asked. The blade and the orb at the end of the handle of the sword would glow with the light of Oral Muti, just like how all the other swords forged in the metal of Oral Muti would do. When Rose would hold her sword, the light of Oral Muti would shine forth through its blade in colors that no other sword carried. It's of the same metal, but also set apart from the rest. They say that Oral Muti made it special, and is so wonderful to behold that it looks like the aurora lights bursting and shining through the metal. Virginia looked at the sword. Its crystal blade and orb reflected pretty colors by the light of the fire glowing around her, but nothing came forth through the blade. "So, I'm not Cohen then?" she asked, somewhat relieved. Daniel and Andrew looked at each other for confirmation. Seeing that neither of them objected to the girl's question, Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but before he could utter a word, a light breeze swept through the room and continued to gust stronger and stronger. The flames from torches and channels of fire around them began to blow in the current of the wind. "What's happening?" asked Virginia in a frightened voice. "What's going on?" She looked at Daniel, who was looking around the room for a sign of some kind. Finding none, he slowly turned his head back towards her, a smile stretching across his face. The wind began to spin faster and faster around Virginia, like an invisible vortex. Then, all at once, the fires were blown out. The room fell into complete darkness, and the winds ceased to gust. Virginia screamed and jumped backward, her back falling into what felt like Charles's chest. Her breathing became hard and frantic. "Uncle Andrew!" she cried out in the darkness. "Daniel!" Suddenly, a bright white light exploded in the room in the middle of Daniel, Andrew, Charles, and Virginia. She screamed, closed her eyes, and turned her head away. "What is that?" she said, swinging her sword out in front of her. "What is that?" Virginia felt Charles's hands fall upon her shoulders. "Virginia," he whispered into her ear. "Look." Virginia opened her eyes to a wonder that shined away fear itself. A bright light that captured the room with its splendorous glow came from the blade of Aurora. Colors of light purple, green, blue, and even gold and even silver danced in composing radiance on the blade and the orb of the sword, as if the aurora lights were captured in its blade. The whole room was filled with its magnifying glory. "Many men and women have held that sword," said Daniel, "but the only time when Aurora would shine forth her light was when Rose Cohen herself would wield her." Virginia looked up and saw Daniel and Andrew staring at the sword of Rose Cohen as if they were moths to a flame. Hopeful smiles glowed on their faces. "Cohen," said Daniel to Virginia. She looked up at him with confused, frightened eyes. "Welcome back to Alaythia," he continued. He placed his fist on his heart and bowed his head towards her. "Your Highness." Andrew placed his hand upon his fist and bowed his head the same. "Your Highness." She felt Charles's hands leave her shoulders. She spun around and saw him also placing his fist upon his chest and lowering his head in respect, but he never took his glowing eyes off of hers, nor did he cease smiling at her. "Your Highness," he said. She turned around and looked back at Daniel and Andrew, and it was only then that she saw a mural on the wall that she had somehow missed before. Painted upon the stone above the chiseled opening was a picture of a woman spinning around. Her white dress and hair twirled together in the same flowing motion. Her eyes shone like the stars of the heavens, carrying a beauty beyond this world, yet a dangerous ferocity of a wildfire. She wore a smile on her face that brought hope and courage and mocked the darkness. In her hands, following with the same sweeping motion of her dress and hair, was a sword that shined brightly like a flash of lightning and an explosion of colors. Dancing around her, flowing with her movements, was a spinning fire that originated within her. Sitting behind her was a four-legged animal that towered at least 2 stories high. His fur was as golden as the sun. His mane was thick, wreathed in a blazing flame about his face. Each of his eyes burned with fire. Inside of his powerful jaws, behind his massive teeth, billowed breaths of fire. He stood behind her, watching and protecting her like a lion guarding its cub. "Who is that?" asked Virginia. All 3 men looked up in the direction in which Virginia stared. "That is Rose Cohen," said Daniel. "And who is that behind her?" she asked. "Or what is that behind her?" "The great devourer of Alaythia," said Daniel. "He's also known as Ashiel." She looked into the glowing blade again and then back up at the painting on the wall. "Who am I?" "I think," began Andrew, "that it is time for Her Highness to rest." "Aye," said Daniel. "I think the same for all of us. There is much to consider now. There are many plans that must be made, many meetings that must be made, even outside the city of Gaal. Nevertheless, we must focus on them tomorrow and not the present." He held up his extinguished torch and laughed humorously. "Your Highness, if you would be so kind, please keep Aurora out of her sheath until we reach the top. It would be most appreciated." Before Daniel pushed open the door at the top of the stairs, he turned around, looked at Virginia, and handed her the sword sheath. "Your Highness, for now, sheath Aurora. You must present this evidence before the council sometime in the future in a carefully strategized way. Otherwise, we might face another uproar, like earlier this evening, which would cry out for a non-strategized war." She took the scabbard from Daniel and sheathed Aurora. However, the blade's light continued to shine even in the sheath, and the orb on top continued to glow with its aurora light, splashing its breathtaking colors upon her face. "You'll have to hold it by the sheath," said Daniel. "As long as you hold its handle, it will continue to glow." "Oh!" exclaimed Virginia. She released its handle, and the light began to fade to a softer illumination until, moments later, it was completely dark in the room. Virginia only had to wait in the dark for a few seconds before she saw Daniel's face looking at her by the light of the opening door in front of them. "Remember, Virginia," he said, "this must remain hidden for the time being. You may wear Aurora around your waist, but do not draw her out of her sheath, not until we have forewarned the other leaders." She nodded her head, assuring Daniel that she understood. "Good," said Daniel. He pushed open the door the rest of the way and walked out. She followed, accompanied by her uncle walking beside her, and Charles behind. Andrew, Charles, and Virginia continued to walk up the stairs a little more, giving Daniel room to shut the door that led into the secret chambers. The thick old door turned on its creaking hinges and ended with a muffled thud as it made contact with the stone door frame. With the turning of the key, he locked it closed. "Shall we?" said Daniel with a perky smile. "Shall we what?" asked Virginia. Daniel lifted his hands toward the continuing stairs. "Shall we take a look at your new quarters?" Virginia looked at her uncle, asking with her eyes if she was to say yes or no. Sure. Is it really curfew time, though?" Daniel chuckled. "Oh, no. We just thought you might like to sit down at your new quarters." He pointed to her backpack and perhaps unload any burdens from your shoulders. Virginia slipped her thumbs underneath the straps of her backpack and held on tightly. "It's okay. I don't mind." Daniel shrugged his shoulders. "Suit yourself. Now, what would you like to see next?" Virginia's eyes widened. "What would I like to see next?" "Yes, what would you like to see next here in the city?" With her eyes still widened, Virginia gazed at the stairs. "What do I want to see next? What kind of question is that? Everything." She looked back up at them with her eyes lit up. "Show me the whole city." "The whole city? In one evening, my princess, I do not think that we can fully accommodate that in the amount of daylight we have left." "I think I have a way," said Charles. Virginia turned around and looked up at him, hoping that what he had in mind was really true. "Oh?" questioned Daniel. "And how is that possible, my prince?" Charles crossed his arms, smiled, and looked up. "Take her to the top." Virginia looked over at Daniel and saw a peaceful look on his face. "Ah," he said, "marvelous idea, my prince. To the top we shall go." Daniel walked past Virginia, Andrew, and Charles and proceeded up the spiraling flight of stairs. "To the top?" she asked Charles. He placed his hand upon her back, urging her like an excited kid to walk up the steps. "To the top of the tower. Hurry, hurry. We've only got about 30 minutes of sunlight left." Virginia soon shared the same excitement as Charles had inside of him. She looked up and saw her uncle and Daniel already out of sight around the bend of the staircase. With an adrenaline rush, she broke out into a sprint up the stairs. At first, she was running just to catch up to her uncle and Daniel. However, upon hearing the pace of Charles's feet getting faster behind her, she began to run faster. "Whoa!" she exclaimed, almost running into her uncle's back. With a quick spin and a hop to the side, she dodged him and Daniel completely. She was about to slow down and behave herself until she saw Charles running past her. It was then that she felt the adrenaline rush once again. Like a sprinter for the Olympics, she took off up the stairs, sometimes jumping 2 or 3 steps with a single stride. She heard her uncle and Daniel shouting at both of them, but she did not understand what they were saying. Her heart raced, her legs burned, and her eyes looked up with the winding stairs for any obstacles. "Losing your touch, are we?" echoed Charles's voice up the stairs. Virginia was about to shout back, but saw his racing heels kicking in front of her as she drew closer. Pushing herself harder, she raced right past him. "Are you?" she shouted back. She ran a few more steps when, from around the bend, came 2 men. Virginia screamed and held her hands out for impact. She and Charles ran into one of them, and all 4 fell to the ground. Virginia had no idea who they were. Judging by the sound of metal hitting the ground and seeing 2 spears lying beside them, she guessed they were soldiers. She hopped to her feet and continued bolting up the stairs. "I'm really sorry," she shouted back at them. She heard Charles scrambling to his feet. "Me too!" She was almost out of breath, but when she saw Charles out of the corner of her eye, she held out her hand and placed it on his chest, pushing off to gain speed and holding him back simultaneously. "That's cheating again," shouted Charles. Virginia laughed as she fought to keep him from passing her. She held her other hand out in front, hoping to shield herself against anything coming her way. Her restraint upon Charles was not holding. He reached his hand past her. She had no idea what was in front of them, but she had to hit it first. Within the blink of an eye, she made it around the final bend of the stairs, and in front of them was a wooden door with an iron door handle. Virginia slapped the door with her hand. "Yes, I did it! I won!" "I beg to differ," said Charles. "Take a good look." She looked next to her hand and saw Charles's hand upon the door beside hers. "So? So? I beat you, girl." She leaned in towards him. "Prove it, Prince." "Prove it? You cheated again. When you cheat, it's practically like handing over your chances, so technically I won the game way back down the stairs." She placed her hands on her hips. "That's not cheating. That's called tactics. If you applied tactics, you would have just as good of a chance as anyone." Charles rested his arm up against the door and leaned in towards her. "When are you going to start abiding by the rules, Princess?" She leaned in closer. "When are you going to apply tactic, Prince?" "When are either of you going to open the door?" asked a voice. They both turned their heads and saw Andrew and Daniel standing behind them, each one smirking at Charles and Virginia. Virginia felt Charles's hand brushing past her side. She looked up into his eyes. "Allow me," he said. She looked down at her side and saw his hand reaching for the door handle. With blushing cheeks, she turned her head away and stepped over to the side by her uncle. Charles pushed the door open. A red glow from outside came flooding in. The air was chilly, but the cool breeze was pleasant, like an early autumn evening. Charles stepped out first. "Go on," encouraged Andrew. Virginia wrapped herself in her green cloak and stepped through the door, squinting her eyes at the setting sun's light. After her sight adjusted, she saw a stone wall about waist-high in front of her. Charles stood leaning up against it. "You wanted to see the whole city?" he asked. Virginia nodded her head. "Then come and see." She walked over to the edge, stood beside Charles, and looked over. 8 stories below, covered in a blanket of sunset glow, sat thousands of 2- and 3-story townhouses, apartment complexes, and commercial buildings that stretched for hundreds of acres. Surrounding the shelters in the distance was the 40-foot wall that stretched around the city. Virginia stood in awe of the sight. It looked so much different from this view. Andrew came and stood on the other side of her. "This is known as a city of refuge, my dear. People from all tribes, nations, and tongues come to this place for help, answers, guidance, and so on. Many have come to take shelter here permanently. Some come to stay only for a season of study and training." study and training?" she questioned. "Where do they do this exactly?" Andrew pointed his finger out into the distance. "That building right there is in the middle of the city. It's a big circular one that looks like the Colosseum back on Earth. It's a special arena where we train Elyamine's warriors to fight with the metal of Oralmuti. If they don't learn how to fight properly, they risk hurting themselves or others around them. As the dark forces of this world become darker, they realize they need to develop stronger fighting skills. That is why they come here, to train and to take back to their people what they have learned. So they come here to learn how to fight. That's so cool." "And to study," added Daniel. Virginia looked past her uncle and saw Daniel standing beside him on the other side. "Many people come here asking questions," continued Daniel. "Questions about the nature of Oralmuti, questions about King Alayamine, questions about the history of Alaythia. It is here that we share with them the ancient writings of our forefathers, and also the letters of Oralmuti. Some people spend days upon days translating copies of the letters of Oralmuti into their own language, and the stories of those who lived here before us to take back to their people. They read them as reminders of hope that the darkness will not last forever, and that the light will eventually chase away every shadow of darkness." Virginia stood staring, studying every single building, corner, and alley of the city below her for as far as it would stretch. "This place is amazing." Her eyes trailed far into the distance, following the city wall as it stretched across a promontory about 200 feet into the ocean water, at which point it stopped at a small castle, founded at the end of the headland. "What's that way over there?" asked Virginia. "Over where?" questioned Andrew. Virginia pointed out into the distance, "That small castle-looking thing at the end of the city wall. What's that?" "That is called the Southwest Eye," said Andrew. "Inside of it are 200 armed soldiers, prepared to hold the walls for an enemy attack. That fortress alone is meant to help cover the south end of the city for any enemy ships or a brigade that would attempt to charge along the beach." 200 men? Is that enough? No, but those numbers were not put there to hold back an entire army, but to hold the wall until reinforcements from within the city would come. He pointed his finger over to the left, straight ahead of them. "Look, that is another one called the Southeast Eye, the same number of men armed for the same purpose, to hold the southeastern point of that city closest to the mountainside until reinforcements come. And over here are 2 more, just like it," said Daniel, walking around the other side of the tower. Virginia followed her uncle and Daniel as they walked to the other side. When they stopped, she noticed that the land down below within the city walls began to change from a city environment into an agricultural landscape. The walls stretched even further out towards the north, encompassing even more hundreds of acres of land. She saw many kinds of vegetation growing in various plots and rows. Corn was the only one she could identify from the tower's height. The rest she could not begin to guess what they could be. However, there was a section of many acres fenced off from the rest of the land, where she spotted familiar herds of animals grazing upon its pastures, cows, goats, and sheep. Directly below her was a vineyard of about 30 acres with men down below pruning its grapevines. She saw Daniel lifting his finger out before them. "That one is called the Northeast Eye," he said. He moved his arm over to the left. "And that one over there running out into the ocean, like the Southwest Eye behind us, is called the Northwest Eye. Both of these fortresses play the same role as the ones behind us, to hold the wall from any attacks against us by the sea, land, or mountains until more warriors can be sent to assist." Virginia looked at the different castle fortresses and how the same wall joined them. It looked like a giant game of connecting the dots. "So I take it this is where you supply the city with its food source?" "Yes, indeed," said Daniel. "I find it a bit unorthodox, how you have this set up." "However do you mean?" "Well, usually in books and such, whenever I've seen a castle, the farmland and village city life are outside the walls. This is probably the first time I've seen a city like this willing to stretch its entire wall structure around the city and the farmland." "Well, when you want to protect your people and your property, I believe it is always best to keep those behind your borders," said Daniel. "This wall was built by our ancestors ages ago. The north wall between the northeast and the northwest fortresses was still being completed back during the days of the Great Division. About 10 years before the fall of the City of the Lion, our forefathers thought it highly important to build and fortify another city in case an enemy were to attack and destroy any of the major cities within the land of the waters of Alaythia. This city was near completion when the City of the Lion fell into the hands of Aphalaham, a powerful kingdom at the time located in the far northern territories. Thousands of men, women, and children who escaped the enslavement of the Alaythia uprising fled to this city. As the story goes, the Alaythia armies followed them down and began to make their way into the city walls. However, they were overthrown by those who remained loyal to Oralmuti. Burning Eagle was amongst those who chose to stay and fight. He helped to lead the armies of the city against the Alaythians. Eventually, the Alaythia, a people driven by their lust for war, lost all taste for bloodshed as over 130,000 of their soldiers lay dead on the ground between the unfinished wall and the land beyond. "It was a day that shall be remembered," said Charles. "Over 130,000, questioned Virginia. "That's impossible, to defeat that many with a number that could have been in there, isn't it? Not without help, anyway." "You would be correct, my dear," said Daniel. "Thankfully, we were not alone that day. We had help from some powerful friends." Virginia looked at him. "Can you tell me about how it happened?" Daniel smiled. "I think that story would be better appreciated when it can be told in its entirety. Perhaps tomorrow or the day after." Virginia looked back at the wall in the distance and breathed a long sigh. "Another question that will have to wait." "Okay." "That," said Andrew, pointing to some distant plot of farmland. "What's that right there?" Daniel looked closely, trying to see what Andrew was pointing at. "What's what?" "That, right there, that piece of land that's being tilled. What is going in right there?"
"That's where the new plot of zucchini is going."
"What? That was not what we all agreed on. Who authorized this? You should know, you were there at the last meeting. We all looked at the map together and thought that this was where it should go."
"You're tilling it up now. You can't plant zucchini at this time of the year."
"We're preparing the soil for the spring. Why? Utilize it for current needs and then till it up again in the spring before you plant." Virginia became disconnected from the discussion between her uncle and Daniel as it pertained to previous talks that she was never a part of. As boredom began to sink in, she heard Charles walking away. She turned and watched him walk around to the west side of the tower. She looked at her uncle and Daniel as they continued their conversation about the importance of properly managing the soil, and then she looked back at Charles. "Hey," she said to the two elders, "I'll be over here if either of you need me." Andrew and Daniel continued talking as if they had never heard her. Virginia stood waiting for a moment for one of them to acknowledge her. "Okay, I think they heard me." With that, she walked over to where Charles stood leaning against the wall, looking out into the distance. "What are you doing over here?" she asked as she leaned on the wall beside him. "Taking in my favorite part of the tower," he said. She looked out into the west with him. The sun's golden, yellow, and blood-red colors were skipping out on top of the waters of the distant, calm ocean. The sky was beginning to darken above, but the light of day continued to shine like a city of gold on the horizon. She looked at him. The light of the sunset brought a warm glow to his face. She noticed that he was whispering something as he gazed into the distance. She listened closely, trying to pick up any words he was saying, but she could only catch a little, which was, "For what shines with the dawn shall overcome the terror of the night." "What was that?" she asked. He looked at her. "What was what?" "What you were saying." A faint blush crossed his cheeks, and he turned his head back to the sunset. "Oh, it's nothing. Oh, come on, tell me. I want to hear." Charles paused for a moment before answering. "It's just a poem that I wrote. I wrote it about 2 years ago during a time in my life when I was lost and alone in a forest that I should not have entered. A hungry pack of forest phantoms was pursuing me, and I almost became their meal. Through the kindness of Oralmuti, I was rescued. I like to keep it with me and read it as a reminder that no matter how dark things can get, there is always hope. After retelling the story of Burning Eagle and the armies of the city holding their fortress with their very lives, I just felt it appropriate to speak it again to myself." "What's the poem called?" He looked at her. "What Shines with the Dawn. Would you mind sharing it with me?" That old blush returned to his cheeks as he closed his eyes and lowered his head. Virginia leaned in closer. Come on, please." Charles raised his head, took a deep breath, and looked into the horizon again. "I lie alone in the dampness of the night. I watched the sunset and vaguely remembered its passing light. The stars in the heavens are blocked by a blanket of clouds. Fear spreads its wings over me, seeking to become my shroud. Though stars are veiled and sunlight hidden, there remains a sign of hope, a light that chooses to stay within. Men spit their hate, and devils shoot their fiery arrows, yet I will choose to hear the sign of hope, for it guides me through the narrows. My enemies beg for my death, Horror tries to blind my sight, yet I will not close my eyes, for what shines with the dawn shall overcome the terror of the night." "That's beautiful," she said. "Can you write me a copy of that?" Charles reached down into the top of his shirt and pulled out what appeared to be a money purse tied around his neck. He opened it and pulled out an old, worn-out, folded piece of paper. Slowly opening it up, he gently placed it into her hand. "It's yours," he said with a warm smile. Virginia looked at the paper and held it gently as it fluttered in the wind. It had torn sides and weathered creases. "Charles, is this your original copy?" "Yours now." "Charles, you don't have to give me this one. If you're willing to give me a copy, you can just tell me and I'll write it down, or you can write it down for me, or—" She handed it out for him to take. "I can't. This is too special." Charles took her hand in his and folded her fingers around the page. What if I said there was something even more special at hand? Her eyes fell into his. Their world and everything in it passed away as he became the only thing in front of her. His warm, strong hands engulfed hers like a clam holding a pearl. She stood there and waited. "It always brought me hope in my darkest hour," he said, releasing her hands. "If you ever find yourself in one of those darkest hours of life, I want you to have this close to you and never forget what shines with the dawn." She looked down at the paper in her hand, gazing at its script. "That's his writing. Thank you." He gave a little bow of his head to her. "My princess." He leaned forward against the wall. The sun had almost entirely set over the horizon. Virginia leaned on the wall beside him again, holding the paper close. "Can I ask you something?" she asked. "Sure," said Charles. "When are you going to tell me who you are?" Charles smiled and continued staring out into the distance. "Why do people call you a prince? What are you a prince over? Why is there something about you that remains a mystery? Focus on you and why you are here," he said, "and then we can talk about me." He looked into her eyes. "You are the most important thing at stake here. When you understand who you really are, you will bless all of Alaythia to a measure you could not have imagined. You have a right to ask these questions about yourself. But what does that have to do with who you are?" "More than you could possibly know." Just then, the light over the horizon began to dim. They both looked ahead and saw the sun sink behind the edge of the world. The lights of the golden city reflected off the sky and clouds as the glow of twilight faded steadily away in the evening. "It's time to head back down," came Andrew's voice from behind. Virginia and Charles turned around and saw Daniel and Andrew waiting for them. "We're ready," said Charles. "Well, my princess," said Daniel, "how did you like your first view of the city?" Virginia closed her eyes, soaking in the memory. "Oh, it was breathtaking. Thank you." "Well, we are delighted that you enjoyed it. Now, how would you like to see your room?" Like a train wreck, the whole day's exhaustion crashed on Virginia. The thought of retiring to her very own bedroom sounded nothing short of heavenly. "Oh, that would be wonderful," she said. "Shall we?" said Daniel, walking around to the door. Daniel and Andrew led Virginia back down the stairs, with Charles following behind. To her, the stairs seemed to be a lot longer of a walk down than they had been earlier. However, her mind was beginning to wander in countless, clueless thoughts as sleep began to weigh heavy on her. At times, her walks would be like autopilot. She would walk while thinking and have not the slightest clue what she was walking on or past. "Here we go!" exclaimed Daniel's voice. Virginia nearly jumped out of her skin. "What in the—" She saw Daniel opening a door that led out of the spiral staircase. "This way," he said, walking through the door. Virginia followed her uncle through the door. The door opened into a long stone hallway that stretched on and on and on, with torches mounted on the side of the left wall all the way down. She saw Daniel walk about 3 doors down and open one to the right of the hall. "Here you are, my princess," he said as she approached. "Your new quarters." Virginia stood in the doorframe looking in, but had difficulty focusing on anything in the room. "There's no light in here." "Oh, right," said Daniel. He reached down, grabbed a torch off the hall wall, and entered the room. "Now, what do you think of it?" he asked. Emotional awareness and decorum were slipping away from Virginia as sleep weighed heavily upon her, like a thick blanket. She looked and only took notice of 2 things: a bed and a nightstand next to it, with a candle on top, which Daniel was lighting with his torch. "Oh, it's perfect," she said in a slurred speech. She walked into the room, heading straight for the bed. Well, just to let you know, said Daniel, as she walked past him, your uncle will be staying in the room next to yours, to the right, as you walk out. Should you ever need anything, he will be close by. She pulled her boots off by grabbing the heels of her shoes with her toes as she walked. Then she unfastened her belt and propped her sword and backpack against the nightstand. With arms spread wide, she fell face flat on the bed. She sank into the mattress, which felt like falling deep into a cloud. She slid her arms underneath the pillow and fluffed it up. As soon as she did, she realized that there was more than one pillow on her bed. She never bothered to get up and count how many, but just began to tightly wrap her arms around some like multiple teddy bears. She heard what sounded like a metal object being placed on the nightstand next to her. Here is your key, dear one, came Daniel's voice faintly. We will leave you to rest. Don't forget to blow out the candle before you leave us to your dreams. Okay, she murmured through her pillows. She heard footsteps leaving her room and the door closing behind her. She was drifting off to sleep when she remembered the paper still in her hands. She twirled around and plopped on her back, holding the poem up to read. Even with tired, droopy eyes, she studied every word on the page with joy and delight, trying to squeeze out as much energy as possible to stay awake and look at what he had given her before sleep took her captive. She held it up for a few minutes before laying it next to her on the nightstand. She rolled over on her side and continued to stare at it for a moment longer. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to find my answers. I'm going to get to the bottom of all of this, once and for all. I'm going to know who I am. She leaned over to the candle but gazed down at the letter one last time. And I'm going to find out who you are, soaring eagle. She drew a quick breath and blew out the candle. The village of Rivershire was always known for its foggy, mysterious climate. Nestled on the green prairies between the sands of the ocean and the pine forests, it was the only village within miles of any civilization. Nicknamed the Village of Shepherds, it was renowned for its fine trade of wool, which the town's villagers made and wore. A fair distance from the village, the shepherds of the town kept watch over their flocks as the evening grew darker and darker. One shepherd, in particular, kept his eyes on the ocean, gazing back and forth between the sea and his flock. "Keep your eyes on your flock, Ethan," said a voice in the night. Ethan turned around and saw one of the elderly shepherds staring at him. "Sorry, I can't help it." The older shepherd leaned against his staff and chuckled. "What, afraid that one of the daughters of Rachnanal will surface for a kiss before she drowns you?" The shepherd shuddered at the thought. "Don't kid like that." "Oh, lad, don't torture yourself with such thoughts." "I'm not torturing myself. I'm just keeping an eye out." The man placed his hand on his hip. "Lad, this village has not been attacked by such a force in generations. You should not concern yourself. Besides, they spend most of their time swimming in the depths of the graveyard of ships. They have other things to hunt." "That's what concerns me. Our village sits near the end of the graveyard of ships." The elderly shepherd turned his back and continued minding his own flock. "The end of the graveyard is a half a day's journey from here. On foot, not by boat. Or for them swimming, especially at their speeds." "Lad, drop it. You're making this job a lot harder than it needs to be. Just keep your eyes on your flock and nothing more. It's not like our lambs are grazing near the border of Skalgal Muderets." Ethan drew a deep breath and looked down at his sheep grazing around him. He turned his head and looked out over the horizon again. The evening fog began to thicken across the ocean. He looked down at his flock, brushing his hand across a lamb that drew close to nibble at his shoes. He looked up again at the ocean. "What's that?" shouted Ethan. Everyone looked but saw only the dark evening distance veiled by the fog of the night. "What's what?" asked another shepherd. Ethan rubbed his eyes and was now in disbelief, squinting his eyes and trying to see through the fog. "It was there a moment ago. It was a dark shadow on the waters." "Ethan, I think you're seeing things," said one of the shepherds. "Just keep an eye on your sheep and don't worry about what's in the distance." Everybody went back to tending his flock, but Ethan, unable to shake his concern, continued to stare back and forth between his flock and the sea. Looking over his shoulder, he noticed something in the dark, a shadow within the fog, coasting along the waters like a ghost with dark sails. Behind it was another like it, and another, all fading in and out of the foggy night. "There!" Ethan exclaimed. The elderly shepherd, speaking earlier, reached out with his staff and nudged Ethan in the back. "Quiet, Ethan. Do you want to scare the sheep away? Who cares if there are ships?" But Ethan continued to stare in disbelief into the coastline. It was then that he saw small, winged shadows in the distance flying off the larger shadows. Ethan held his staff defensively in his hand. "Everyone!" "Shh," someone whispered from beside him. The winged creatures flew closer and closer. "Everyone!" shouted Ethan. "Look up! Look up!" Annoyed, the shepherds looked at Ethan but became silent as they saw the dark winged shadows flying over their heads and into the edge of the pine forest behind them. Every shepherd in the field looked intently into the tree line of the woods. A cold breeze that sliced to the bone fell upon them all. "Ethan, what was that?" asked one of the shepherds. "What did you see?" Ethan just held his staff ready as his sheep continued to graze. "I don't know." "What's that?" exclaimed one of the shepherds in fear. 6 large, dark figures the size of horses walked on all fours out of the edge of the woods. Each one had a pair of green, ghostly eyes glaring hauntingly at them. "What is that?" shouted one of the shepherds, backing up and holding his staff in front of him. One of the beasts raised its head in the air and let out a howl into the sky. All at once, the 6 beasts charged at the shepherds. In the silence of the evening, the only sound for miles was men shouting in blood-curdling screams, mixed with wolves barking and baying at the sadistic thrill of their hunt.
This is the end of Chapter 24. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 25. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.